I've had a number of conversations, even in the past couple of months, with church leaders who've said, at the moment we're spending whatever it is, £2,000 a month renting a building. I wonder what we could get as a mortgage. Great. Our team will happily have that conversation and say, well, based on your current level of gift income, based on your current level of expenditure, taking out the rental, because presumably that would cease if you were to buy a building. This is the sort of level that you might be able to get a mortgage at.
Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name is Adrian Reynolds. I'm the head of National Ministries for the FIEC, and I'm joined today by Paul Houghton. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Adrian.
Thanks for joining us from Sheffield today.
I am from Sheffield.
So you come down the train line? I have,
yes. I've been in, although I don't have a Yorkshire accent.
You don't have a Yorkshire accent?
But I have, with my family, we've been in Sheffield for 20 years now, almost.
Okay.
And having moved from London.
And you work for Kingdom Bank.
I do.
Tell us, first of all, what you do for Kingdom Bank, and then you tell us a little bit about Kingdom Bank.
My title is Chief Executive, so I run the team. I head up the all that we do in terms of thinking about strategy and plans and growing the business in particular. We'll come on to that maybe in a minute. And we have a team of 35 people or so, and based in Nottingham.
Great. And Kingdom Bank has a great story behind it, isn't it? How it came into being, or how it morphed into its present form. So just tell us briefly that story, because it's good for people to hear, I think. People know, perhaps, have heard about Kingdom Bank, perhaps don't realise the backstory so much. Just tell us a little bit about how it came into being.
Sure. It's a wonderful story of gospel partnership, really. If you go back 60 plus years, an innovative pastor from Assemblies of God churches thought or realised that there were some churches in the group that had money and other churches in the group which wanted to buy buildings. And so he set up a trust to sit between them, to enable gospel partnership between those churches, between those congregations, so that those with money could lend to those which wanted buildings. And that happened for the next 40 years.
And then what happened then?
Well, at that point it became, so it wasn't Kingdom Bank then, but then about 20 years ago, roughly, it due to regulatory changes and all those sort of things, it became Kingdom Bank. And is a fully regulated bank, just like
which is no small thing, is it, for a bank to be fully regulated?
Not at all. It's we're regulated in the same way that HSBC and Barclays and others are by the Bank of England and other regulators as well. And so yes, having a banking license is a kind of rare thing. Only banks have them, and that limits what we can do. Or it allows us to do what we can do as a bank.
Yeah. It also means, doesn't it, that perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but there is a certain level of liquidity, a certain level of going concern that is checked by the Bank of England. So if I bank with Kingdom, what I'm trying to get to is if I give you my money, it's safe.
Absolutely, yes. People might have come across the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, FSCS. That is the scheme which exists for all banks. It's exactly the same across all banks. And that basically protects for individuals and for smaller organisations, particularly smaller charities, which would include most churches, probably all churches in the UK, I suspect, would be covered by that. And that protects the first £85,000 that you've got, which basically means that if the bank went under, which is not going to happen clearly, but if the bank went under, then you'd get that £85,000 back very quickly through the compensation scheme.
Well, we'll come back to savings. I want to hear a bit more of the story as to how Kingdom Bank became the Kingdom Bank it is today, because some significant things happened along the way.
Yeah, so we were up to 20 years ago, became a bank, and for the next 18 years, roughly, it existed as Kingdom Bank, owned by Assemblies of God still as that denomination. Yeah. But then, for various reasons, mainly because they didn't have the capital to put into it to grow, it became available as to be bought, and a group of entrepreneurial evangelical investors thought it would be great for the evangelical churches of the UK to have a bank to serve them with, in particular, lending. We'll come on to that maybe later. And they clubbed together with Stewardship, the charity, and to put together about £8 million basically to buy the bank, and to put sufficient into it, both to buy it and to put sufficient capital into it to enable it to grow and serve churches. So and then some of the people who, many of the people at the bank still are the people who were there before, but we've got quite a few new people in terms of leadership and management, and we're growing as well as we're serving more and more churches. And there have been lots of changes as well, which mean that we're now more affordable for lending for churches, and we're here to help churches grow.
Right. And why do we need a Christian bank? I buy my milk from Sainsbury's, not a Christian cow. Why do I need a Christian bank? One, I just go to HSBC or Barclays, or other lenders are available. What is it that's special about a Christian bank? I'm speaking as I'm a church leader, thinking perhaps about buying a building or doing some big project. Why is a Christian bank important?
Well, if I can just hold you there in terms of the two things which people think about of banks. Most people either think about borrowing money or they think about depositing money, savings. Yeah. And those two things are really important from a bank's point of view because they have to grow together if a bank's going to grow.
So just for those who don't understand, we're both. You're a chartered accountant. I'm a ex-chartered accountant. I have to say that. But so we kind of understand a little bit about finance. But basically, the way banks work is they have people save with them, so that there are deposits, and then they can lend that money to others. Yes, so that's two sides of the kind of.
That's exactly right. Really. For some bigger banks, they are much more complicated in terms of what they do. Sure. For what you've just described is exactly what we do, and the level of savings we therefore have as a ratio has always got to be greater than the level of lending that we're doing. Okay. So maintaining that ratio is really important. So as our lending is going up, our savings need to go up.
So in very simple terms, someone gives me £100 from their savings, I can lend a proportion of that to
let's say we're going to lend £80.
Okay, right, got you. Okay, so where were we? Why a Christian bank?
So why a Christian bank? Well, so if you were to listen, we're thinking about the lending side really. Yeah. So if you go to your high street bank, many are available, different brands. If you go to your high street bank and you say, we'd like to borrow some money to buy a new building which to meet, and then to do it up, and they'll say, yeah, great, let's talk about that. Okay. They'll be interested in two things. They're interested in
they're not going to turn you away straight away. Well, just because you're a church,
they might do. They might be a little. They'll probably be hesitant for the reasons we'll come on to. Okay, but they might say, let's sit down and have a conversation. And they're interested in two things. All banks are interested in two things when it comes to borrowing money for a property. One is the valuation of the property, and the other is the affordability, whether you can meet the repayments of a mortgage. Okay. Let's think about the second of those, the affordability. What you'll do, in the same way that you would if you were buying a house to get a mortgage, you'd present them with your income and your expenditure, your monthly kind of income and expenditure, and you do that for a church, and the big number at the top there, and the income is gift income, and the bank will say, well, they won't say because they understand that this, how things work, but they'll say, how much of that is committed for the next 10 years? You'll say, well, people could stop giving next month. And they'll say,
move away or whatever.
And so generally speaking, at that point, banks are not interested. Most banks are not interested because they can't see the certainty of your income stream. But that's what we specialize in. So our specialty is gift income, and pledges as well. So gift income not yet received and not yet banked.
Which is how typically a church would go about a big project. They would say, who's going to give more and who's going to pledge to give more. So that would be something that you would look at and take into account.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. So if you've got a building where you've got a rental income stream, then a high street bank will have confidence. And if you've got a sufficient rental income stream that enables you to get the lending that you need, then actually the high street bank will probably be cheaper than we will.
And presumably, it's the nature of the property as well. Mm-hmm. And the problem with building a big church building is it can't be used for a huge number of different things. If I was buying a residential property, presumably that's more attractive to a bank because over time residential property has increased in value. It tends not to fall away quite so much.
All banks, including ourselves, we are happier with residential property than what we would call commercial property, which is basically anything which is not residential. Right, okay. So your church meeting space is, from our point of view, or any bank's point of view, is a commercial property, not a residential property. We just have those two.
And
types.
Is that a more volatile market?
It is a more volatile market. It goes up and down a lot. And I mean, in our current market, residential property, when we're recording this, people, newspapers are talking about the potential for house prices dropping because of the current economic environment. But because of the lack of supply of residential property, we all know that on a kind of 10-year basis, residential property will continue to increase in value over that time. So we can be very confident, banks can be very confident in residential property, and therefore typically will lend more, lend a higher amount against a residential property.
Got it.
So if you, in case people are wanting to do their calculations, we will typically lend for our best rates. We'll typically lend 70% of the value of a residential property, and 60% of the value of a commercial property. We will go up above that. I'm happily go below that as well. But for the rates, most of the work, most of the lending that we do is at 60% of commercial, 70% of residential.
Okay. Can we just go back to just the first principles a little bit? I guess there's a kind of there's a thinking in churches. Should we have a mortgage at all?
Yep.
A loan that feels a bit like, hang on a minute, aren't we supposed to be no man's debtor? What's the place in church life for churches thinking about loans and financing? Shouldn't we only do building projects when we've got all the money ready to go?
I've just finished being treasurer of my church I've been treasurer for the past.
Can you just clear up? Did they throw you out, or did you just come to a natural end?
After 15 years, I thought it was probably good for somebody else to
so you hadn't embezzled the funds or anything like that?
No, not at all. I think there are probably a number of points there to think about. One is maybe a kind of you might find this an amusing story as I was looking at the role of being chief executive of Kingdom Bank. I thought I probably better be clear what the Bible says about usury, and whether it's appropriate to be charging interest, because that's the basis on which banks work. So I did do some reading on that and felt it was and was happy to apply for the job. We won't go into that anymore at this point, but that's an important point for Christians to be clear on. There's then the question of is it appropriate for Christians to be in debt? And what we're really talking about when we're talking about a kind of typically a 30-year loan for a church to buy a building or renovate a building or whatever, we're really it's a little bit similar to buying your house as opposed to renting your house. So you could and over a 30-year term for a lot of churches, they'll find that renting that the cost of paying the mortgage on that building will be similar to renting a building. Clearly, some churches get a very good deal, and it's a low rent and whatever in a community centre they might be using. But for most churches, typically we're finding that they're coming to us saying we're renting and paying, I don't know, £2,000 a month for the whatever we're using, and to get a similar the building up the road that they'd like to buy, actually somewhere in the same region, they'd be able to get a mortgage for over the next 30 years. After that 30 years, the building is theirs, and belongs to the next generation.
So it ends up almost being good stewardship.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's how we would perceive it. We understand that there are some churches for good reasons are renting property. If I can make another point as well, one of the reasons why the investors got together and bought the bank is because they were very clear that the number of churches needing to buy and renovate buildings over the next few years is increasing, particularly driven by the change in the political climate and the fact that we are less and less a Christian country. Public buildings may be much less available to churches in the future. To rent. A lot of churches in the country will rent schools. But the days of that may be challenged.
Well, we're already hearing anecdotally that in individual schools that's more and more difficult.
And a head teacher doesn't need much to be they only need 3 or 4 letters from parents to say, oh, I don't like. Yeah. Don't like that church renting your school on a Sunday, and they just say no. They don't need to have the law to back them up on that necessarily.
And at the same time, there are more opportunities for buying buildings coming up, ex-church buildings,
yes,
and not just ex-church buildings.
Yeah,
so some more innovative. Tell us some of the innovative things that people are doing with buildings, just to kind of whet our appetite.
Yeah, no, sure. So kind of former church buildings, if we start with those, have traditionally been very popular, and URC buildings and the like. Increasingly, we've and
if they're listed, by the way, they can be a bargain. Because if they can't be used for other purposes,
they can be a bargain, and they can also seem like a bargain when actually they're quite expensive. I'll just explain that. So I recently we were working with a church which was looking to buy which had the opportunity to buy an old URC building in a fishing village on the northeast coast, and they could buy the building for about £50,000.
Right, well,
wonderful bargain. Yeah. But of course, when they'd done the work, you had a survey around and identified all the asbestos and problems that they were going to have. They were going to have to spend £500,000 on it to do it up.
Okay.
At which point, the valuation point of view, this is slightly techie, but at that point, the valuation of that building would probably only be maybe £150,000.
Okay.
Which means we can only lend very little against that. So it actually becomes quite hard. We're trying to do some innovative work on gospel partnership between churches to enable that kind of project to get off the ground. But it's problematic.
So that empty building down the road may be a really good option for you. And we know some stories like that. But actually, it requires a bit more thought.
But maybe an empty retail outlet down the road on the high street, or an empty car showroom down the road, which, increasingly those, as vehicles go electric over the next few years, the expectation is that there's going to be much more just buying online rather than necessarily having to have a showroom.
Yeah.
So car showrooms and retail outlets are definitely two.
And they're often simpler buildings, aren't they, in terms of construction and that sort of thing?
They're built such that you can add partitions wherever you like. They don't tend to have pillars and walls and those in the centre of the building, which make it problematic. So often those are really quite exciting. They're not necessarily the buildings where people think of.
It's not going to win an architectural award, probably.
Unlikely, but they might be beautifully positioned, potentially with car parking space, where people can people come to that, and also with multi-purpose use during the week as well. Not necessarily just for the church family to come together and meet for their small groups, or meet for their on their Sunday meetings and their prayer meetings and stuff. Actually, there's the opportunity,
and probably stuff like disabled access and stuff,
all of that kind of provided, but potentially the opportunity to rent them out for other groups to use.
This may be a techie question to which you don't know the answer, in which case feel free to say don't know the answer. Do churches buying those kind of units get change of use easily?
I think certainly from our experience, it has varied around the country.
Okay, depends
depending
on
what the local authority is, what their view is. But actually, local authorities are very keen. They're local authorities, many of them are pretty desperate about their high streets, and they would love community use buildings. If they want footfall into their high streets, and if your church is saying, no, we'll bring people we'll bring people over the weekend, and
we'll run a toddler group and a seniors drop-in centre and whatever.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, local authorities, unless they're dead set against churches, can be persuaded that community activity operations are a really good thing.
Walk up and down your high street. Walk
around
and see what there is.
Go and see what's available. If you see vacant properties, lots of them will be lease properties, not necessarily ones you can buy.
Right.
But do some investigation, try to find out who owns the property, and is there potential for that to be applied.
Now, so I'm looking for a church building. We're in a 12-year-old church plant. We're meeting in a rented property. Or in fact another church building that we're kind of sort of piggybacking on, I guess, in the afternoons. I've been walking down the high street. I've seen that the old Peacocks is up for sale. Peacocks seems to have gone into administration, so no more cheap socks. And I'm thinking, that's an interesting building. I go and have a look at it. Is that the moment I get in contact with you, or do you want to hear from me at some other stage in the process? At what stage are you going to be useful to me as a church leader? We'd
happily have the conversation at any point, but the point or the opportunity for a conversation is well before that.
Right.
So
because
you might be thinking, what could we afford as a church? Or you might be thinking.
So I might be thinking at the moment, well, we can only afford to rent.
Yeah,
because we're a reasonably small church.
So I've had a number of conversations, even in the past couple of months, with church leaders who've said, at the moment we're spending whatever it is, £2,000 a month renting a building. I wonder what we could get as a mortgage. Great, our team will happily have that conversation and say, well, based on your current level of gift income, based on your current level of expenditure, taking out the rental, because presumably that would cease if you were to buy a building. This is the sort of level that you might be able to get a mortgage at, and therefore you can know, well, we could borrow £300,000, or we could borrow £1.5 million, or whatever it happens to be, depending on the size of your church, and then you can think through what that would mean, whether you'd need to raise additional funds, additional gift income, or whether you could actually cover it with what you're currently paying your rent. And so we'd happily have that conversation, maybe 2 years in advance of finding the right building. And actually what we found over the past couple of years is there are some buildings where they come on the market and they go very quickly. Within 2 months or something, there's a deadline date, and it's sad when we end up having a conversation with a church and they just haven't thought about it, and they're saying, this has just come up but we've got 3 weeks to make an offer, and they're scrabbling around trying to get the mortgage from us sorted out, trying to find the some additional soft loans from members of the church family who might cover the additional amount. And they just don't have very much time to do it. Whereas doing a bit of planning in advance, setting up a little committee of subcommittee of whatever your governance structure is, your trustees, to think through what are the opportunities for where we might like to be as a church in the next 5 to 10 years, and then come to us and have a conversation. And that doesn't bind you to us, and we'll tell you what it would cost in the current climate to borrow the money. But it doesn't tie you to us. But we're a team. All our lending team are Christians. In fact, all our customer facing people, all our leadership and our management are Christians. Not everyone in the bank, but all of those people are Christians who would be delighted to have a conversation.
That's really good to hear. Let's talk about one more thing to do with borrowing before we come to savings, because we do want to get onto savings. So this is kind of all new building. Plants looking for buildings, that sort of those kinds of things. And what if we're an existing building, we want to expand, we want to redevelop, we want to build an extension? I mean, this all sounds like kind of big bazookas, kind of the big new projects. Do you work in that sort of area as well? In terms
yes, absolutely. So there's a I'm not going to mention customer names for obvious reasons. But there's an FIEC church who we've worked with recently, who have developed a building to make it more accessible, kind of disabled access friendly, just warmer. Kind of more insulation and
I like the sound of that.
All those kind of things to basically bring a building that they already had up to scratch, and make it available and usable for people, welcoming place to do gospel ministry on a.
And the same principles are going to apply in those sort of
it's exactly the same. So the short answer is we do development funding. That's the kind of the technical term. So if you wanted to borrow, whatever it is, £300,000 or £1 million to do that project, and then just at the early stages of having that conversation, come and chat with us and see what we could do.
Now let's talk about savings, because you're not going to lend anything without savings. And so this is kind of the other piece of the jigsaw, the other side of the scale. What services are available to churches? So I guess churches on the whole, there'll be some churches who've got very little in the bank. They're operating at the margin, I guess. But there will be some churches perhaps haven't had a pastor for a few years. They've built up a bank, and maybe there's 100,000 in the bank, maybe there's 60, 70,000 or even more in the bank. What should church leaders be thinking about if they've got sort of large savings that aren't actually at the moment being used? Perhaps they're being saved for another moment or whatever it is.
I mean, for all of it, both churches and as individuals, good stewardship is not just thinking about where am I going to give my money away? It's thinking about where am I currently using the money which I have in the bank. And I think we're not very good at that. I think that's a I mean, if I'm honest, before I started working at Kingdom Bank, I'd not really thought about that.
No.
And if you've got £100,000 sitting in the bank and it's sitting in one of our 4 named high street banks, and it's earning a small amount of interest, then it will be what is it achieving there? Well, it's helping that bank fund whatever businesses that bank is involved in funding,
and a nice office in Canary Wharf.
Well, you said that, not me. Whereas, you put it bluntly, if it's with us, it's funding gospel ministry. That's because that's what we do. We would, and I mean, to come back to the kind of the where we started, the kind of story of the bank, what's happened over the past 2 years, the massively exciting thing is that we are growing very quickly, but our growth is being driven by our lending growth, because churches are cottoning on to the kind of things we're talking about today, and are coming to us, and we're having up to 2 years ago, we typically were lending as a bank maybe £300,000-400,000 a month in mortgages in lending. Now we're typically lending between £1.5 and £2 million a month.
Right. Okay.
So we've multiplied 5 times what we're doing in lending, which is brilliant, and much of that is in funding churches. We haven't talked about ministers' housing as well, but we do that as well. But that growth in the lending side, given the kind of ratio stuff that we talked about before, has to be balanced met by the deposit accounts as well.
Okay.
So, and that's a harder thing from our point of view, because persuading people that they might want to come and talk to us about a lending project they've got, a lending need, a borrowing need that they've got, that's quite easy. People kind of jump on the phone and want to have that conversation, and we're delighted with that. Persuading people to think differently about their money, churches and or individuals, and to think about that £100,000 or the £5,000 that they've got in the bank, which is in their reserves, which they could hold with us, that's a much harder sell. But it's very exciting, because it's all about gospel partnership. It comes back to be clear, this is started.
Not just churches, organisations, this is individuals as well.
Very much so.
Can save with Kingdom Bank.
So of our current customers, probably 2/3 are individuals and 1/3 are churches and Christian charities.
There's an effort, we can talk about this one because this is public. There's an FIEC church recently that's taken that step, which is Knighton, and there's a story on your website. We'll put the link in the story notes on the bottom of the the podcast that have just done that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Because most churches, churches are charities, and most churches will have a level of reserves that they have to maintain as part of their reserves policy for the Charity Commission. Now, that won't necessarily mean that it may be difficult to be meeting the month-to-month bills, particularly at the moment. But most churches will have a level of reserves, and whether that is £1,000, £5,000, or £50,000 or £500,000. If we can provide a great home for that, and it would be doing gospel ministry or helping to support gospel ministry in terms of the lending that we've talked about.
Yeah, I guess a lot of churches are sitting on money because they think we're saving it for a rainy day. It is a rainy day, isn't it? Around the country, and that money could be going to good use.
Yeah, so churches will have different kind of pots of money, won't they? Yeah. They will have the level of reserves they need to run things week to week, and that needs to be in their current account.
Sure.
And we don't provide current accounts. So I can be upfront about that, explicit about that. We don't provide current accounts. What we do provide is deposit accounts and savings accounts for people. So, but above that level of what we need to run the week to week, month to month, paying people and paying the rent. Above that, most churches, because of their reserves policy requirements, will have a level of reserves which is their kind of regulatory requirement, like a rainy day fund. That increasingly churches are putting that money with us, which is wonderful. And then churches on top of that will be saving money for different things. So some churches will be saving money just because they don't have a pastor at the moment, and therefore they're accruing funds. And presumably they'll be thinking about what they might do with that in the future. Other churches will be saving money perhaps over a 3 or 4 year period to do a building project which they've got planned, and then at that point, often they'll put that money towards the building project, as well as taking a mortgage from us to fill up the kind of rest, the kind of gap in the funding requirement. So we see churches putting money with us on as they grow a fund over a 3-year period before they do their building project. We see other churches just keeping that level of reserve of their kind of regulatory reserves with us on an ongoing basis, and they can always draw that down. So we've got I'm not here to sell particular products, but if you look on our website, we have reserves, deposit accounts where we have there's a 90-day account where
sure, okay, so it's not I've got to give it to you for 5 years.
No, so they can hold it. They can hold it with us for on a 90-day notice basis, but you can always draw down £10,000. It's a kind of flexible 90-day account, which is particularly helpful for churches. We find.
Yeah, and for individuals, if you have got savings, you could be putting it in premium bonds.
You could,
and getting £25 once a year, or actually you could be putting it to Kingdom Work.
Yeah.
And
isn't that exciting?
If you've decided you're not going to give it away, which obviously is a good thing to do as well, but it's needed for a pension or whatever, you're saving it for something, then actually to put it on deposit and have it used for Kingdom Work, well, great news, really. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Paul, thanks very much for joining us. It's been really helpful, and we're going to get you back to talk a little bit more about finance generally in church life, which is obviously a really important subject. But thanks really for all you're doing. Thank you for Kingdom Bank and the work that the folks there are doing, and bless you in your work. And this has been Independence, FIEC podcast. Do like us, rate us if you like us, or rate us, I guess. And we look forward to catching up with you again soon.